A bill that was drafted to push back against the BDS boycott, organized by the Palestinian civil society, was taken off the House voting floor within this past month. If implemented, it would impose up to $1 million in fines or up to 20 years of imprisonment against individuals, businesses, and advocacy organizations that explicitly partake in the BDS boycott. For refusing to put your money somewhere you don't want to, you could be penalized with these consequences. Now, the First Amendment has been at the forefront of plenty of political discourse for decades. The 5 most basic forms of freedom it entails are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly or protesting, freedom of press, and the freedom to petition. The freedoms of speech, assembly, and petition encompass the right to boycott as denoted by the Supreme Court in the 1982 case NAACP v. Claiborne Hardware Company. Why would legislators intend to block a right of the American people that is quite clearly and historically protected by the Constitution? What precedent would it set if our representatives so blatantly voted against our rights as citizens and consumers to further their political motives? A consumer is defined as a person who purchases goods and services for personal use. This encompasses you and me, your teachers, the 1%, politicians, and every person that lives on this planet. Consumers play a vital role in the movement of money in a capitalist economy and ideally reserve the right to safety, the right to be informed, and most prominently, the right to choose. Some consumers have more power in the movement of money than others, given their level of wealth, influence, and status in our societies and economies. For the purposes of this video, we can interpret the idea of a consumer as the average individual you will find living in a country like you and me. Probably. With the right to choose what we purchase, there is a level of power vested in us to influence the state of the economy. This power may be negligible at the individual level, however, it can mount up to establish a stark influence on our political and socio-economic state when consumers organize and advocate for change on certain issues. A major example of consumer activism is boycotts, which have historically provided grounds for political and social activism. For the lack of power a singular individual may feel they have on the political scene, the simple choice to withhold your money from certain businesses and services is a straightforward task that can build up pressure and draw more attention as more individuals unite together under the same cause. Let's take a look back at a few prominent boycotts and their historical impact on our current social and political state. The South African apartheid, literally translated to apartness, began in 1948 and called for the separate development of the different racial groups in South Africa. The social policy implemented in South Africa attempted to keep racial groups exclusive from each other, criminalizing interracial marriage, more particularly the marriage between white people and people of other racial groups. In the midst of a changing political landscape post-World War II, demands for decolonization and addressing racial inequality became more distinguished, highlighting the segregation present in South Africa. The British anti-apartheid movement, or the AAM, began in 1959 to encourage consumers to boycott South African products. It didn't take an elaborate, deeply researched understanding of the apartheid or even politics to participate. It simply asked consumers not to buy South African goods. No, the process was not quick, nor did it come without pushback from the British government. It was only lifted after 34 years in 1993. The AAM had to adapt to evolving, diversifying South African exports and other circumstances. Prioritizing their boycotting efforts against major fashion retailers such as Marks & Spencer's, the campaign was more effective by focusing on a select few amount of companies where consumers could concentrate their efforts the most. Consumers' tastes and preferences shifted away from South African goods. The demand for South African imports to Britain declined significantly, particularly down 35% for South African textiles and clothing between 1983 and 1986. Business confidence fell to its lowest in the 1980s as a result of disinvestment, dropping from 84 points in 1980 to negative 76 points in 1985. Something as simple as a 21-year-old shop worker in Ireland refusing to ring up a South African grapefruit as part of the boycotts prompted efforts that led to a strike that, with momentum and support, ultimately resulted in Ireland's total ban on South African imports. In junction with activism and striking, the pressure of the boycott became insurmountable and resulted in the decline of South Africa's economy, businesses' success, and citizens' consumer confidence. In 1992, the sitting president, Frederick Willem de Klerk, held a white-only referendum or vote to gauge the level of white South African support in the dismantling of apartheid. A yes vote would indicate support, while a no vote would indicate wanting to uphold apartheid. Large corporations advocated for a yes vote to continue the trend of South African goods already slowly being reintegrated into foreign exchange, subsequent to the negative effects they reaped from the boycott, and Europe encouraged the yes vote by declaring that they would lift sanctions on South Africa's relations with the West. Given a low consumer confidence and isolation from the foreign exchange, the idea of boycotts ending mobilized white South Africans to support the end of apartheid and to vote yes in de Klerk's referendum. The referendum had an 86% registered voter turnout and had a 68.7% majority yes vote. This vote declared that South Africa would be closing the book on the apartheid. Would this have been possible without the pressure of consumers withholding their funding to these corporations? It's extremely unlikely. Another prominent boycott movement, particularly in America, was the Montgomery bus boycotts, which spurred great momentum for the civil rights movement in abolishing legal racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Rosa Parks, a black woman living in Montgomery, Alabama, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus. City buses were segregated, and the law at the time stated that if the white section became full and didn't have a seat available for another white person, a black person would have to give up their seat to said white person. Parks had connections to civil rights activists, serving as the local NAACP's secretary at the time, and called upon black leaders to organize resistance towards the local segregation. The Women's Political Council initiated the organization of a one-day Montgomery bus boycott, effectively deterring the funding of the public transportation service. They concentrated their efforts on city buses, as 75% of Montgomery bus riders were black citizens. The success of this targeted boycott, with over 90% of black residents participating, became a catalyst for the civil rights movement. The Montgomery Improvement Association, or the MIA, was formed to sustain the boycott that ended up continuing for 381 days. Black residents found other methods of transportation through organizing carpools and taking taxis with black drivers who would charge their services at the same price as the bus fare, or even extensively chose to walk up to 8 miles, demonstrating the power of choice when organized and focused. The MIA filed a federal suit in a district court against bus segregation, and the court ruled in favor of the MIA. The city of Montgomery appealed this ruling to the higher Supreme Court, which upheld the district court's ruling on a federal scale, ending the boycott once the decision went into effect. Yes, the ruling was from a legislative standpoint, but the boycott's targeted focus encouraged people to participate in activism and mobilize them to feel that their actions could translate into tangible change. It provided an integral component to the civil rights movement alongside careful organization, active protesting, and it provided the grounds for strong, trusted leadership figures like Martin Luther King Jr. A more recent example of an effective boycott was the boycott against Bud Light, primarily enacted by a conservative audience, subsequent to a Bud Light promotional collaboration in April 2023 with Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender influencer. The success of this targeted boycott can be attributed to a high accessible presence of alternative light beers with similar taste and availability, beer being a product often consumed in public rather than private, and prolonged media coverage of the boycott. Well-known conservative figures in support of the boycott, such as musician Kid Rock and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, would rally support on social media and often depict the destruction of Bud Light bottles. The former executive of Bud Light's parent brand would often be interviewed by conservative news platforms such as Fox News, mobilizing those news outlets' audiences even more. Bud Light's brand sustained over 2 continuous quarters of sales declining, with the brand still reaping effects of the boycott today. After 20 years of Bud Light being the top-selling brand of beer in America, Modelo and Michelob surpassed it in popularity. The company lost a significant portion of its loyal customers who still have not been incentivized to return to purchasing Bud Light. Boycotting derives its strength from the masses uniting under the same cause. When communities band together and people work to open up avenues of accessibility for each other, we can work towards providing a distinct influence on those that represent us to ultimately be able to partake in and impact the political and social scene we live in. What doesn't help enable this unity is shame culture fostered by online scrutinization of individuals' every activity. People have called out various public figures on being spotted with Starbucks, emphasizing the call out rather than the call in to why people are boycotting. While this may potentially allow people to become more self-critical and more conscious of where they are purchasing, shame culture spurs this growth in retaliation towards fear. Yes, someone being made afraid to buy Starbucks may result in one less consumer purchasing from the company, but it doesn't automatically translate towards this person grasping the root cause of the issue. Instead, it oftentimes leads to the resentment of a cause. Additionally, there are reasons as to why someone may not be able to boycott. A lot of the campaigns backed by BDS are rallied against fast food places, which are often the most or only options accessible to food insecure households. People may struggle to find comparably priced and location-friendly alternatives, especially in rural areas. It is important to not jump to conclusions about the reasoning someone may not be partaking in a boycott, as we can fall into the trap of virtue signaling. Boycotts and activism are deeply sewn into the roots of America's history, so once again, I beg the question, how can our representatives so blatantly desire to disenfranchise us of that right? The existence of this bill at all indicates that the government is worried about the impact the BDS movement has had and can potentially still have. For them to go out of their way to attempt to criminalize a consumer's right to choose and so blatantly strip that right, to the point where opposition of the bill is shared by both right-wingers and pro-Palestinian organizations who rarely find themselves in agreement on the same issues. With the proper methods of outreach and networking, the power boycotts hold to influence economies and legislation is historically and statistically immense. The government going so far as to attempt to infringe on these consumer rights only further reinforces the political power consumers have in choosing where to put their money. We can make the choice to withhold our money from complicit corporations in order to support those who don't have the power to choose. We can choose to make a tangible impact and continue organizing, no matter how small we feel our individual impact is. In continuing to make these choices, we can propagate the liberties and freedoms of marginalized peoples through the aggregation of our small individual impacts. When we don't make the efforts to bring ourselves to action, we degrade the autonomy and self-determination of all people, including our very own communities. Let's look to the historical change that activism in the past has provided and work to restore fundamental human rights, starting first by recognizing the power we hold within ourselves to achieve tangible and legitimate reform in the world we share together.